The wind howled through the quiet neighborhood, rustling the bare branches of the old oak trees that lined the street. The sky was a soft shade of gray, heavy with the promise of rain. Most people had already retreated to the warmth of their homes, but one figure moved slowly along the cracked sidewalk. A frail elderly woman wrapped in a knitted shawl, her steps steady but careful. Her name was Margaret. In her late 70s, she had lived alone for years in a small house at the end of the street, a place filled with memories of a time when the house had been livelier, when laughter had echoed through the halls. But now it was just her, and the loneliness had become something she carried with her, as familiar as the lines on her hands. Margaret was returning from the market, a small bag of groceries tucked under her arm, when she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. Near the entrance to a narrow alley, curled up beside a trash bin, was a dog. Its fur was matted and dirty, its ribs faintly visible beneath its thin coat. The poor thing looked exhausted, its eyes half closed, as if it had given up hope. Margaret felt a pang in her heart. She had always had a soft spot for animals, but ever since her husband passed, she had hesitated to take on the responsibility of a pet. Still, she couldn't just walk away, not when the dog looked so helpless. She crouched down, ignoring the protest in her knees, and spoke in a soft voice. "Oh, you poor thing. How long have you been out here?" The dog's ears twitched, but it didn't move. It simply looked at her with those deep brown eyes, filled with something Margaret couldn't quite place. Pain, fear, or maybe something else. Carefully, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small loaf of bread. Tearing off a piece, she extended her hand. "Here, sweetheart, you must be hungry." The dog hesitated, sniffed the air, and then slowly took the piece of bread from her fingers. Margaret smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. It was a simple thing, offering food to a stray, but in that moment, it felt like more, like she had done something meaningful. She glanced around, wondering if the dog belonged to someone, but the street was empty, just the dim glow of streetlights flickering in the distance. There was no collar around the dog's neck, no sign that it had a home. "You need a warm place to sleep, don't you?" she murmured. The dog didn't move, but its eyes stayed on her, watching. Margaret sighed. Maybe she couldn't keep it permanently, but she could at least offer it shelter for the night. "Come on then," she said, rising slowly to her feet. She took a step back, giving the dog space. To her surprise, it stood up, and with cautious steps, began to follow her. Back at her house, Margaret opened the door and ushered the dog inside. It hesitated at the threshold, sniffing the air, before stepping in. The warmth from the heater filled the room, a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. Margaret set down her groceries and found an old towel, laying it near the fireplace. "There," she said gently. "You can rest here." The dog circled a few times before settling down, its body finally relaxing. Margaret sat in her chair, watching it, feeling an odd sense of comfort in its presence. That night, for the first time in years, she didn't feel quite so alone. But as the hours passed, something began to feel strange. In the middle of the night, Margaret woke to a faint sound, a soft whimper, almost like a whisper, coming from the living room. At first, she thought it was the dog, maybe having a bad dream. But as she listened more closely, her skin prickled. It wasn't just a whimper. It was something else, something that sounded eerily like words. Margaret sat up in bed, her heart pounding. That was impossible. It had to be her imagination. But then, she heard it again. A hushed, almost pleading sound. Frowning, she grabbed her robe and shuffled toward the living room. The dog was still curled up by the fireplace, its body motionless, except for the slow rise and fall of its breath. But something felt off. The air felt heavier, like something unseen lingered in the room. She hesitated before stepping closer. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" she whispered. The dog's ears twitched, but it didn't move. Margaret knelt beside it, placing a gentle hand on its fur. And then, just as she was about to pull away, the dog's eyes snapped open. They weren't just brown anymore. There was something else, something deeper, almost unnatural, as if they held a secret too heavy to bear. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know why, but in that moment, she felt a chill race down her spine. The dog blinked slowly, and then, in a voice so soft, she almost thought she imagined it. She heard it whisper, one word, "Help!" Margaret's blood ran cold. She stumbled back, her mind racing. Had she really just heard that? It wasn't possible. Dogs didn't talk. She must have been half asleep, her imagination playing tricks on her. But the dog was still staring at her, its gaze unwavering, and then, as if sensing her fear, it did something unexpected. It nudged its nose against her hand, a soft, comforting touch, a gesture that said, "Don't be afraid." Margaret swallowed hard. She had spent years thinking her life had become predictable, that nothing extraordinary could ever happen to her. But now, sitting in her quiet living room, staring into the eyes of a stray dog that had whispered a word that sent chills down her spine, she realized she was very, very wrong, and whatever secret this dog carried. It was only the beginning. This introduction sets up the suspense and mystery, drawing viewers in and making them eager for the next part of the story. "Let me know if you'd like any tweaks." Margaret sat frozen, her breath shallow, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She stared at the dog. No, not just a dog. There was something else, something more behind those eyes. She had heard it. She knew she had. That single word, "help," still echoed in her mind, making the small familiar space of her living room feel strangely unfamiliar. The dog didn't move. It just watched her, its gaze steady but pleading, as if waiting for her to understand something she couldn't yet grasp. The room felt colder somehow, though the fire still crackled softly in the hearth. Margaret's fingers trembled as she reached for the blanket draped over her chair, pulling it tightly around herself, as if that could shield her from whatever was happening. "This is crazy," she whispered to herself. "I must be imagining things." But deep down, she knew better. Taking a shaky breath, she cautiously extended her hand again. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, it let out a quiet sigh and pressed its head against her palm. Margaret felt the warmth of its fur, the steady pulse beneath it. Real! This was real. She swallowed hard and forced herself to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. Who are you?" The dog didn't respond, at least not in words, but something in its eyes flickered, like a memory trying to surface. And then, just as suddenly as the moment had come, it was gone. The dog lowered its head, curling up again as if exhausted. Margaret sat there for a long time, unable to move, questions swirling in her mind like a storm. By morning, the rational part of her was screaming at her to forget it. It had been a trick of her tired mind, a dream slipping into reality. But as she walked into the living room, she found the dog still lying there, its eyes half open, watching her in a way that made her skin prickle. She busied herself making tea, trying to push away the unease that lingered in her chest. She had planned to take the dog to the local shelter, but now she hesitated. Something told her that wasn't the right thing to do. As she stirred her tea, her gaze fell on the dog again. "You're not just any stray, are you?" she muttered. The dog simply blinked. Margaret sighed. Well, I can't very well call you dog forever. She thought for a moment, then smiled faintly. How about Charlie? For the first time, the dog's ears perked up slightly, as if recognizing something. Familiar. Margaret took that as a sign. All right then, Charlie it is. As the days passed, Margaret and Charlie settled into a quiet routine. She made sure he had enough food and a warm place to sleep. He followed her around the house, always watching, always listening. Sometimes he would sit by the window, staring out at the street as if waiting for something. But the strangeness didn't stop. Late one evening, Margaret was washing dishes when she heard it again, a whisper, barely audible over the sound of running water. This time, she knew it wasn't her imagination. She turned sharply, her heart in her throat, but the living room was empty, except for Charlie, who was lying near the fireplace, his eyes open, watching. Margaret hesitated before stepping toward him. The whispers had stopped, but the air felt heavy, thick with something unseen. She knelt beside him, her hands resting on her lap. Charlie, she murmured, if there's something you need to tell me, I want to listen. The dog didn't speak, not like before, but this time, he moved. He stood up, stretched, and then padded slowly toward the front door. He turned to look at her, his eyes filled with something that sent a chill through her. A silent request. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for her coat. She wasn't sure why, but she knew she had to follow him. The air outside was crisp, the moon casting long shadows on the pavement. Charlie moved with purpose, leading her down the sidewalk, past houses that had long since gone dark for the night. He led her to the edge of the neighborhood, where an old, abandoned house stood. Margaret hadn't thought about this place in years. It had been empty for as long as she could remember. Its windows boarded up, the front gate rusted. No one ever went near it. Charlie stopped at the gate, his body tense. Margaret swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the fabric of her coat. "Why here?" she whispered. The wind howled softly, sending a shiver down her spine. Charlie stepped forward, pushing the gate open with his nose. It creaked loudly in the silence. Margaret hesitated, her heart hammering. Every instinct told her to turn back, to leave this place alone. But another part of her, something deeper, something she couldn't explain, urged her forward. She stepped. Through the gate, the air inside the yard was still, unnaturally so. Charlie led her toward the back of the house, where an old shed stood, half hidden by overgrown vines. He stopped in front of it, his nose brushing against the door. Margaret's pulse quickened. Slowly she reached out and touched the handle. It was cold, even through her gloves. She took a deep breath and pushed. The door groaned open. Inside, the darkness was thick, swallowing the faint moonlight that spilled in. But then, as her eyes adjusted, she saw it. Something buried beneath. Dust and time. Something that made her blood run cold. A small tattered blanket, a rusted chain, and beneath it all, a box. Margaret stepped inside, her breath coming in short gasps. Charlie sat beside her, his gaze locked onto the box as if he already knew what was inside. Margaret hesitated, then slowly knelt down, her hands shaking as she reached for it. The wood was old, brittle beneath her fingers. She lifted the lid, dust spilling into the air, and what she found inside made her heart stop. Something long forgotten, something meant to stay hidden, and now there was no turning back. Margaret's breath hitched as she peered into the old wooden box. The dim moonlight filtering through the cracks in the shed barely illuminated its contents, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw something that sent a chill down her spine. A stack of faded yellowed papers sat neatly inside, alongside a small, rusted locket. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the topmost paper, unfolding it carefully. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. Missing person report. Margaret's stomach twisted as she scanned the page. It was dated nearly 3 decades ago. A name stood out at the top. Daniel Whitmore. She frowned. The name tugged at something deep in her memory. Where had she heard it before? Charlie let out a soft whimper. His eyes locked onto the locket. Margaret reached for it, her heart pounding. The metal was cold against her palm, and as she pried it open, she gasped. Inside was a tiny worn photograph of a boy. He couldn't have been older than 6 or 7, his face framed by messy curls, his eyes bright and full of life. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. The boy looked familiar, and then it hit her. She had seen this face before, in an old newspaper article, in whispered conversations around town. The Whitmore family had lived here, in this very neighborhood. Daniel had vanished one evening while playing in his backyard. They had searched for weeks, but he was never found. His disappearance had haunted the town for years. Margaret's fingers clenched around the locket. What was all of this doing here, buried in an abandoned shed? Who had hidden it, and why? She flipped through the rest of the papers, finding more reports, more clippings. There were notes scribbled in the margins, details about the search efforts, theories, suspicions, and then at the very bottom, tucked beneath everything else, she found something that made her blood run cold. A letter. The paper was fragile, edges curled from time. The handwriting was uneven, hurried. Margaret's eyes darted across the page, reading each word carefully. I never meant for this to happen. I only wanted to keep him safe, but I was too late. I tried to fix it, but it all went wrong. I didn't. Nowhere else to put the truth. So I'm leaving it here. Maybe one day, someone will find it, and maybe somehow they'll understand. The letter wasn't signed. Margaret's hand shook as she lowered the paper. The truth? What truth? What had really happened to Daniel Whitmore? Charlie let out a low whine, his tail thumping anxiously against the dirt floor. Margaret turned to him, her mind racing, and then the realization settled over her like a heavy weight. Charlie hadn't just led her here by accident. He had known, somehow in some impossible way, he had known exactly where to take her. Margaret looked at him, her chest tightening. Could it be? The way he had watched her, the way he had responded to the name Charlie. Was it possible that he wasn't just a dog at all? A lump formed in her throat as she thought about it. It was absurd. It defied everything she knew about the world. But standing here, in this abandoned shed, holding the final clues to a mystery that had long been forgotten, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just uncovered something far greater than she had ever imagined. A gust of wind rattled the shed door, and Margaret shivered. She carefully placed the papers and the locket back into the box. This wasn't hers to keep. It was something that needed to be brought into the light. She turned to Charlie, her voice quiet but firm. We have to tell someone. The dog didn't move for a moment. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, pressing his forehead gently against her leg. A silent agreement. Margaret knew what she had to do. The next morning, she made her way to the local police station, carrying the box carefully in her arms. She explained everything she had found, leaving out only the parts that would make her sound like she had lost her mind. The officers listened, their expressions shifting from skepticism to shock as they sifted through the evidence. An investigation was reopened. The discovery made headlines in the town. People began to talk again, remembering the little boy who had once played in their streets, whose story had faded over the years. And then, weeks later, a breakthrough came. The shed, The letter, the missing clues, everything led to a long-buried truth. Daniel had been taken by someone he trusted, someone who had meant well, but had made a terrible mistake. He hadn't survived the night he went missing, and in a desperate attempt to cover up what had happened, the truth had been buried, literally and figuratively. Justice came in its own quiet way. Margaret watched from her porch as the town mourned, as the Whitmore family, though aged and changed, finally got the closure they had been denied for decades. It wasn't the ending anyone had hoped for, but at least the truth was no longer hidden in the shadows. And through it all, Charlie remained by her side. One evening, as the sun set over the quiet street, Margaret sat in her chair, stroking Charlie's fur. She had never spoken her theory out loud, never dared to voice the impossible thought that had stayed with her since that night in the shed, but she didn't have to. Charlie looked up at her, his deep brown eyes filled with something unspoken, something that told her he understood. Margaret smiled, her heart aching in a way she couldn't quite explain. "You can rest now," she murmured, running her fingers gently over his head. The wind whispered through the trees. The world was at peace, and for the first time in years, so was she.